Hi, I'm Dom,
And I'm Luke.
and we're on a journey to document and discuss every attraction ever.
Mr. Toad's Wild Ride is a dark ride that was one of Disneyland's opening day Fantasyland attractions on July 17th, 1955, based on the adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad film from 1949. Aboard, you become Mr. Toad himself, where you recklessly careen through the English countryside and streets of London before getting drunk, drink driving, and ultimately meeting your demise being run over by a train and ending up in hell. A nice, family-friendly Disneyland classic. But Dom, have you ever gone to hell at Disneyland?
So I did, but I haven't as a kid. So I've been to Disneyland a couple of times. I'm still on the edge as to whether I went in 1999. I can't get solid proof of actually whether I did go because I don't remember. And apparently my parents took me. I don't know. Maybe I was just left at the hotel. It's possible. But I've gone in 2008 and 2022. But I always skip this one because when I went in 2008, I was a teenager. And I'm like, ugh, Fantasyland dark rides? Boring. Yuck, who would want to do that? But then when I went back, you introduced me to this absolutely absurd attraction, and it blew my mind this still exists.
As a 16-year-old, you could have got your first taste of alcohol and driving all in the same attraction. Little did you know, Fantasyland was the coolest land of them all.
What was trying to send a message? He was always like, you know what? No alcohol, no facial hair at my Disney parks, but you can if you ride my secret attraction.
Which, this attraction for me is a must-do every time I'm in the park. It ticks those boxes, it's a relatively short wait most of the time. It has so much going on that every time you ride it, you're gonna see something different. And it's still wacky enough that every time I get off, I'm like, this could be the last time I ever ride this, because I can't believe it still exists at the happiest place on earth.
It did exist also at Walt Disney World, which I guess we'll kind of summarize them both into this one, because we don't need to talk about both of them, but it did close. This is the last surviving remnant of Mr. Toad in the Disney park. So should we get into some spicy history of this attraction?
Yeah, let's jump straight on in. This attraction is based on half of the already short film, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, which comprised of two unrelated stories. This is also where the Headless Horseman comes from, this film, but the two halves of the film are completely unrelated. It's literally two 30-minute short films that they packaged together in one so they could sell it for a feature film ticket price.
That's really bizarre. So it's the Headless Horseman and Mr. Toad.
Yeah, and The Wind in the Willows, which is kind of their adaptation of The Wind in the Willows, the famous book. So the ride itself is based on an even shorter part of that short film where J. Thaddeus Toad goes on a reckless and wild drive around the British countryside. Like all Disney dark rides at this point, the 1955 exterior facade of the ride was fashioned to resemble a colourful medieval tournament tent because Disneyland ran out of money, and you could feel it all over the park. Fantasyland a little bit because of the tents, and Tomorrowland a whole lot because there's pretty much nothing there.
Except for chemicals. They talk about chemicals a lot at original Tomorrowland.
Monsanto, back again. Embellishing the boarding area of this original ride was a huge, elaborately painted mural that gave you a glimpse at the insanity to come, and an updated version of this painting can still be seen in the attraction today.
Is that within the actual attraction itself? So like when you walk into what I would say is actually quite a nice facade these days.
Yeah, the new Fantasyland facades from the 80s are still really nice.
They've done it up to kind of look like a mansion, which I'm sure we'll elaborate on a little bit more. But when you walk inside...
It's a specific
mansion? A haunted mansion? Oh, sick!
No, wrong land. So this 1955 iteration of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride wasn't complex. It contained simple gags, a few set pieces and characters. It was just 98 seconds long and was filled with the early Disneyland era painted plywood flats as theming, essentially. While the ride today still has a lot of painted plywood flats, in the past, it was all painted plywood flats. It was like no 3D, very little movement. It was just go down to the hardware store, pick up some paint cans and some plywood, and there's your ride.
There's a reason why they say that the early Disney parks were built on a suitcase and a dream, because that's pretty much all that was holding them together. Walt Disney would walk around and be like, we're going to build an entire theme park on $10 million, and I want you to make a groundbreaking ride, and here's a few rubber bands, a thumbtack, and a paperclip. Go nuts.
As we were saying as well a bit earlier, an updated, more elaborate 2-track version of the ride would open as a Fantasyland attraction with the Magic Kingdom as well in 1971. So it was one of the few rides that opened for opening day at Disneyland and for the Magic Kingdom. This version, though, would close in 1998, and today is where the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh is, which we do have more of a story to tell, but we'll tell that at the end when we talk about the legacy of the ride, because it had a whole big thing when it closed.
Yeah, I've heard stories about the closure of the Walt Disney World version, and literally people scrambling to get onto planes to go there.
Protesting inside the park, outside the ride.
But we'll get into that a little bit later. We don't want to jump ahead of ourselves. Or could I say, leapfrog ahead of ourselves. Unlike other Fantasyland dark rides, it is not a direct retelling of the film that it was based on. Its ending in particular is an original scene that has no basis in either the 1949 film or the original novel. Originally envisioned as a roller coaster, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride was realized as a dark ride because Walt Disney felt as though a roller coaster might not have been appropriate for young children and the elderly. And in fairness, he kind of had a point. Early Disneyland was meant to be a kind of reversion from what amusement parks had become. Disney invented the theme park concept, but before that, you still had things like Santa Monica Pier, which had plenty of roller coasters, or similar, like what you could call roller coasters today. But part of the problem was you would go there and it would be full of servicemen and teenagers, and it would just attract kind of the grossest of people in society at the time. Not gross. Gross is a mean word. It was rough. And Walt didn't want that. He wanted a family park, and I think he was worried that bringing those kind of thrill attractions into his park would bring the wrong crowds. I think it was a good call for the early park.
Yeah, and I think the real interesting thing to me that still blows my mind is he didn't want this ride to just be rideable by the young children and the elderly. You can take anyone on this ride. There is no height requirement. You can bring a newborn baby on this ride, and apparently that's allowed.
Do you reckon they would allow you to just put the baby on it and like go around in circles? Kind of.
I wish, but no. They have to be 7 years old.
To go by themselves?
But it's that trick, where people will claim their like 6-year-old child is 3, so they still get into the parks for free. Do you reckon it works the other way, where a parent's like, nah, my child's definitely 7, just so they can ride Mr. Toad by themselves?
It's a literal baby just flailing around. They're like, yeah, this is a 7-year-old. They're like, well, I can't ask. Can't ask for proof, so I guess I just have to take your word for it. The cast member's just like, that's a baby. That is a baby. The ride was completely remodeled with the new Fantasyland in 1983, with the most obvious change being the exterior. It became Toad Hall rather than just a pavilion from a medieval fair. Both Mr. Toad and Peter Pan, which shared the same show building, would be completely demolished and built back from the ground up, with Mr. Toad becoming a best-of collection of scenes from the 2 versions that came before it. This remodeled version, which mostly followed similar story beats, is the one we'll be discussing today, as it's the only version both of us have experienced. And I didn't actually realize there was a 2-track version before this. So was that like 2 simultaneous tracks similar to, say, Midway Mania or something like that?
Yeah, and one of the first parts, the first scenes within the Magic Kingdom version was a simulated, like, almost crash between the 2 different tracks.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Which did get Eisnered at one point, though, because they had to, in order for that to work, they had to dispatch both cars at the same time. But then Eisner came in and was like, no. Who cares about show quality? We just got to pump people through the rides. So they would just dispatch them as soon as they were ready and would no longer essentially have that scene.
That's like the most disappointing thing about dueling rides is when they're not dueling. We had this at Universal Studios where they have 2 dueling roller coasters and then every now and then they just wouldn't. It just leaves you hanging, It's kind of that experience.
I think I've been on 3 dueling roller coasters before, And only one time have I ever actually had them duel the way they're meant to.
Do you reckon if we went back in time, we could make them duel on this?
On the one-track version at Disneyland?
What if you just send two in opposite directions?
Where are they going to meet in the middle?
It's the most thrilling kind of dueling.
In this new version, guests enter the queue in the garden portion of Toad Hall. Passing by the relatively lackluster gardens, you enter Toad Hall itself, where a large statue of the namesake welcomes you. Now, this statue is interesting because it originally had a pose more similar to the partner statue, where, you know, it was kind of one hand was down and the other hand was looking out. However, people realized that you could put cigarettes between Mr. Toad's fingers when his hand was reaching out. So they essentially chopped his arm off and resculpted both his arms to be behind his back now. And if you know where to look, you can kind of see where they've remolded it.
That makes a lot of sense because the pose that he's doing is kind of in such a way that it's like puffed out. So you can imagine if he's like got his arms out, it would make sense. And then you just put them behind. I didn't know that. That's really cool.
Yeah, I think there may be the one at the cemetery at the Haunted Mansion at Walt Disney World. I think he may still be in that original pose.
So if you've got your cigarettes and you need somewhere to put them,
and you can climb a fence, you know where to put it.
It would be worth the trespass warning.
So a large mural again shows the adventures of Toad and his motorcar, foreshadowing various scenes you yourself are about to experience in the ride. This mural also has a hidden reference to Walt Disney himself. If you look up at the train, we all know Walt loved trains. So the name of the train in this mural is actually called the WED Rail, W-E-D, or Walter Elias Disney Rail.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's not a hidden Mickey, it's a hidden Walt. Not enough of them.
I have a feeling that Walt Disney constructed Disneyland as a front just so that he could have trains just everywhere. Everything's technically a train at early Disney. You know, you had other attractions like the Monsanto chemical exhibit or whatever it was, the Hall of Aluminum and the Future Toilets. I believe that was legitimately an opening day attraction. Future Toilets, I don't know what it is, but it sounds intriguing. But Walt just seemed to constantly be like, yeah, let's chuck some trains in. Yeah, do you reckon we could sneak some more trains in here? I don't know, like if you've got any trains that I could ride.
Is it that every version of the Disneyland plans, the most prominent thing from when it was like Mickey Mouse Park at the studio all the way to Disneyland, like every planning document, the train is, you know, first foremost thing that you notice.
There is a story from shortly after Walt passed away, and Disneyland, the park, was fighting with Walt's wife, Lillian. And so she decided to come back one day, storm into the park, because she still technically had ownership of many things, and just started like grabbing stuff and going, that's mine, get it out, like tearing the place down. I feel like Walt would do that knowing that Shanghai Disneyland doesn't have a train. I think he would just walk in there, start tearing it down. Like, no, this is not why I made Disneyland. If I could, I would call it Trainland, but no one's going to come to it, so I have to use my stupid last name.
Do you reckon he'd be even more infuriated the fact that they have a fake train station? He'd get his hopes up. He walks in, he's like, here it is. Here's the train station, finally. And then he can't get up there. There's no train.
My most modern theme park, the latest one, the culmination of everything the Disney company has worked towards. Show me that train, boys. I can see the station up there. And like, Mr. Disney, Walt, if I may call you that, we don't have a train here. And he just goes into a 1950s ecstasy-fueled rage.
Yeah, as all 1950s businessmen, I feel any cliche 1950s businessman is one removed train away from just imploding.
With no height restrictions, any and all guests can hop aboard miniature 1900s multicolored motor cars. The name of one of the characters from the film, Mr. Toad, Toady, Ratty, Moley, McBadger, Cyril, Winky, or Weasel, is inscribed on each motor car. And I think if you got any other name than something like, you know, you have sophisticated ones, Mr. Toad, you have McBadger, Cyril, and then you got Moley. Just like,
Would you be offended if the cast member was like, "Sir, can you just wait for one more ride vehicle and let the other group go in front of you?" And then the ride vehicle he got for you was Molly.
Molly or Ratty.
Okay.
I'm just going to stand there, actually. Next time I go, I'm going to wait. They're going to be like, what are you doing, sir? I'm waiting for Ratty. I don't ride any other. I ain't riding Winky.
Oh, no, Winky sounds like the eighth dwarf who didn't make the cut.
Passengers begin their journey by crashing into a library where McBadger is seen teetering atop a ladder with a stack of books. They then crash back through the fireplace, all in view of guests waiting the queue. Rounding the next corner, you narrowly avoid a falling suit of armor before breaking through a set of doors to find the interior hallway of Toad Hall in disarray. As weasels swing from chandeliers, guests then enter the dining room, where Molly is having a meal at a dinner table and gets knocked aside. Poor Molly. Feel sorry for Molly.
I think the craziest thing is also this is like 10 seconds. It took you longer to read that than it actually is on the ride. I genuinely, when researching for this, there was moments where I was like, so that's what's actually happening. Because it is so fast, you can barely absorb it.
You kind of turn a corner and then into another corner and then you back out into the loading bay. And it does kind of feel like the ride starts and then it ends and then it starts again. That little bit where you come back out into the view of the guests, you're like, oh, I guess I'm back. Hi.
And they're always looking at you like, why is the ride so short? They legitimately, I swear they think it is just go into the fireplace, out of the fireplace. All right, see ya.
There is one attraction in the world, which is literally just you go around in a circuit and then come back. And it's a certain one at Universal Studios that many people don't like. And it's Fast and Furious Supercharged. It's literally just a circuit. It goes around and it comes back.
Which you're in a car, you drive around like crazy, and it's in a circuit. So they just rode the first part. They actually didn't ride it. They just saw the guests doing the first loop and were like, that could be a Fast and Furious ride right there.
They're like, you know what Mr. Toad's Wild Ride needs? Vin Diesel.
50-foot tall Vin Diesel. That's what it needs.
On a helicopter, outrunning the law. I still don't know what that ride was about. What is Fast and Furious Supercharged about? I don't know, but it's not relevant.
I don't think your brain having the knowledge of what it's actually about is a good thing.
Yeah, that's fair.
So upon leaving Toad Hall, guests travel through the countryside, passing Ratty's house and countless policemen trying to stop your wild ride.
If I may just quickly, at this stage, are we Mr. Toad or are we just us?
No, we're Mr. Toad.
Okay, so this is from the perspective of someone else who's not us.
Yeah, which is interestingly the only version of that kind of storyline that's stuck, because that's what used to be in Peter Pan, that's what it used to be in Snow White, and the guests were like, I don't get it. I just don't get it. But for Mr. Toad, they're like, of course I get it. I am Mr. Toad. How could I not get it?
A lot of the time, they had complaints where it's like, I did the Peter Pan ride. Where's Peter Pan? I did the Snow White ride. Where's Snow White? And then they had to literally just add them in. But that's why the original iteration of Snow White's Scary Adventure was meant to be scary, because it's like, this was scary for Snow White, and you're Snow White. And everyone's like, that's too high concept for me.
You also died at the end of Snow White. There was some weird stuff going on in these early Fantasyland dark rides. They had that issue where a lot of comedians don't know how to finish a sketch. They didn't know how to finish a ride, so they just killed you at the end. So you barely avoid colliding with traffic, which is actually just yourself in a mirror, but it's a kind of a cool effect. And then you barely...
They brought it back. They brought back the collision.
That's the budget version. You almost collide with yourself. You then go past one of the weirdest parts of the ride where there's like a farmer and all of his farm animals happen to be standing on a bridge for some reason that you like almost crash into. And he's like, please, not my farm animals, which for some reason I'm just taking on a walk around the city. But you swerve out of the way. You start heading for the docks. You're kind of bumping along the boardwalk sort of area, going to crash into the water, which is an effect they also use in Pinocchio where it looks like you're about to crash into the water and get eaten by Monstro. But this is where it originated. So they love that trick. You then again take a sharp turn to not do that, because that's what this ride is so far. It's like, oh, you're going to crash into this. Just kidding. You actually aren't.
The other thing as well with this attraction that at this stage it's like, oh yeah, I can see how this is all progressing. Again, in the time that Luke has mentioned all of this happens so quickly. It's so fast. And you can't comprehend half of it. The bits that you do comprehend are usually the audible sound cues that when everyone comes out of it, they know the part where the judge is yelling at you, which we're about to get into. I promise no spoilers. But those are the bits that you take in. Everything else is just visuals because you have it over like the left-hand side, the right-hand side in front of you. There's so much to take in. So we're kind of summarizing that, but at the same time, it's very quick.
So just like you've done countless times in the ride, you quickly take another sharp turn, this time into a completely logical location to go, a warehouse full of TNT and fireworks, because it's a wild ride, all right. You then crash through a brick wall as the warehouse explodes behind you in a burst of bright, flashing lights, and then head out into the streets of London. You narrowly avoid another collision with a delivery truck, and then enter Winky's pub, where Mr. Winky himself holds 2 beer mugs, spinning them around in the air with no liquid flying out. He then ducks down and the beers just stay spinning in the air. I have no idea what's meant to be happening. How is he a wizard? Is Mr. Winky a wizard? How is he levitating these beers and spinning them in his hands?
With a name like that, the only job he can get is being a wizard. It's a hard economy. Dude's gotta make a living.
Gotta do what you gotta do.
Passengers then enter the town square, where the car wreaks further havoc on the citizens. A statue of Toad and Cyril Proudbottom stands in the center of the town. Behind this statue is one of Lady Justice peeking out from under her blindfold. Next, guests enter a juryless courtroom where the riders are proclaimed guilty by a judge, based on the film's prosecutor for the Crown. The cars then enter what is presumed to be a dark prison cell before breaking out, abruptly turning right and landing on railroad tracks. The vehicles bounce along the tracks in the dark before colliding head-on with an oncoming train. And again, all of this just happens back to back. This is no Rise of the Resistance where you have plenty of time to comprehend what's going on. No, that's like 5 seconds for 10 rooms.
Oh, and all that sticks in my mind is the judge just being like, guilty, guilty, and then you're hit by a train. That's pretty much exactly what it feels like. And the train is the simplest effect of these kind of lights on a railing above your head coming towards you. But I'd be lying if I didn't say as a kid, I thought that was a real train and I thought I was going to get crushed. Passengers then arrive at the ride's final scene, Hell, or as known by cast members, the Inferno Room, because cast aren't allowed to say hell on stage.
No hell here, man. No. Do you want to go get some hell? Do you want to come ride Mr. Toad's Wild Ride? We got some hell. No hell here.
In order to make this the Inferno Room, the entire room is heated and the scenery features small devils who bounce up and down. Passengers also see a demon who resembles the judge from the courtroom scene, and near the end of the scene, a giant, towering green, fire-breathing dragon emerges and attempts to burn you to a crisp. A glowing green light is seen in the back of his throat. He coughs, you speed away, and with no explanation as to why, you then are back in the ride's unload area where you disembark.
This is a real whirlwind of an attraction.
Yeah, it's a while. It's probably, 2-3 minutes max? But there's 15 minutes of content packed into that 2 minutes.
That's the thing, when you consider stuff like Rise of the Resistance, for example, what I brought up before, the story is, you need to escape the Star Cruiser. So you get into your vehicle and then you go along, someone finds you, they shoot at you for a little bit, and then you escape the cannons and then you leave. And that's the story of Rise of the Resistance once you get on the ride portion. There's no going to hell, literally dying, being prosecuted by a judge, and then having little demons trying to burn you to a crisp. I would say that the Imagineers these days just aren't even trying.
They wouldn't be brave enough to even pitch this idea anymore. Interestingly, the reason some people say that the ending is so abrupt is because in the ride, in the storyline of the ride, you just stay in hell.
Huh.
That's why it's so abrupt. But of course, it's actually a theme park ride, so they need to get you off at some point. It's not Mr. Bones' Wild Ride. You're not going to be there all day. So in universe, if you've been on Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, according to Disney canon, you are permanently in hell now.
Oh, well, that makes sense. Yeah, I think Disney would want me there after some of the things I've said about them in recent years.
Which, to be fair though, you are Mr. Toad at this point. So it's Mr. Toad who's staying in hell forever. And according to the Walt Disney Family Museum, this is true. This whole story, this idea where he gets drunk, he goes drink driving, he gets sentenced to prison, he crashes and goes to hell. That is the actual story as confirmed by the Walt Disney Family Museum. And the reason he goes to hell is because Toad must pay for his mania, his damage to property, and his flaunting of the law. First in prison, then down in hell. And this is an official statement from the Walt Disney Family Museum confirming this.
Oh, okay. I always thought it was rumored. I didn't realize it was actually confirmed.
Yeah, which is wild that they're trying to tell a moral story here of don't drink drive. I mean, it's a good, you know how there's always the moral at the end of the story of, Jack and the Beanstalk or Hansel and Gretel. There's always something to grab from it. It's not usually as literal, though, as don't drive drunk, don't drive your car around the non-streets, don't crash into people, and definitely don't escape prison.
The thing about the moral of the last attraction that we did, Body Wars, was don't be a white blood cell. The moral of this one is don't drink and drive because you'll get caught and you'll die and you'll go to hell.
I think one of the reasons as well this ride is so infinitely re-rideable is because of how fast we've been saying it is. There is always something new to see. It's a relatively small space, but it just flies by. You're probably not moving that fast, but each scene is so tight and so compact, and you're whipping around the corner to see something new. I think after 50 rides, you'd still be noticing something new.
I believe part of the reason why it goes so quickly is essentially if you imagine the attraction split up into almost 1 meter square blocks. That's basically the space that you're in. There's no points where you're in like a grand scene where you can see everything around you and it's vast and it's big. It's pretty much the walls are within like arm's length away from you, that everything's really tight in around you. They're able to use all of these effects and these 2D flats alongside some 3D illusions to really create that sense of pace because it is so close. If you tried to do the same thing, even just a little bit bigger, it wouldn't work as well because it would take too long to get from scene to scene. They're able to do it because it is quite claustrophobic.
Which is interesting. It's really the only ride that feels like this. Most of the other Fantasyland dark rides have at least one scene where you're in it for long enough to be like, oh, neat, look at that. Oh, neat, look at that. But this, nah. So interestingly, the Disneyland version of this ride, as we're saying, is the only one surviving. But it also is the only opening day Fantasyland dark ride that hasn't had a plussing up. Most of them now have projection effects. Most of them now have some more intense animatronics that have gone through. I think Snow White's Enchanted Wish was a relatively recent addition, and the Peter Pan one was a few years ago. So it's looking like maybe this one will be next. But do you think Disney will be brave enough to touch this ride with the whole story that's going on? Or are they just going to let it be forever, essentially?
I feel like if anything happens, they're going to replace the intellectual property. Like, for me, even as someone who's pretty immersed within the Disney ecosystem, things such as Mr. Toad's don't immediately jump out as something recognizable. And I think that would be the case for many people. Like, when you walk around Fantasyland, you know of Peter Pan, you know of Snow White, and you see Mr. Toad. The first thing I actually thought, is this a Winnie the Pooh character? So that's kind of why it makes sense as to why it eventually became a Winnie the Pooh ride elsewhere. But I just didn't know who this was, what it was about, what was happening in the attraction. But Disneyland has that benefit where, because it is Walt's park, they will often go through and keep certain segments as like this is almost a time capsule of the way Disneyland was at a particular time. And it's not always from opening day, but there are definitely certain segments where it's like, well, this is from the 90s, this is from the 80s, this is from the 70s. And because it does have such cultural significance, I think generally they don't want to touch attractions like this because it would be like removing something like the Jungle Cruise. You can bless it up, you can't get rid of it. But if you do, pray to God that it's something so much better.
All of the opening day Fantasyland dark rides still exist to this day, which kind of is a testament to not just the quality of them for the time, and obviously after all the plussing up that they've had, but that idea of, I took my kid to the park and, I was taken to the park by my dad, who was taken to the park by his dad, like that family lineage. There is those classic Fantasyland dark rides that can still be ridden by everyone and have kept the popularity throughout the years. All of these, sure, don't get the same wait times of Rise of the Resistance, but rarely are they a walk-on either.
You don't want them to have long waits either, because one of the problems that Disney has is people expect a long wait to give them a bigger experience. And I know people personally, and I had to hold my tongue when they said this, but they went to Disneyland for the first time last year. And what they're dealing with now is people who are going either for the first time or haven't been for a long time. They've paid a lot of money. They're paid for things like Genie Plus. And then they go on a ride like Pirates of the Caribbean, which has significant historical, significance with us. But for them, it's kind of a bit basic. And why, after waiting 2 hours, are they just going around looking at a few vignettes and a couple of different show scenes with some animatronics from the 60s?
Walt always said parks aren't meant to be a museum where they stay stagnant. But for people like us, we kind of like that mix of museum and modern. But yeah, Disneyland is probably the best example of that balanced mix between the two. But that's for us. If you're a guest who only wants thrills and is expecting, big new stuff to be the quality of everything or the style of everything else, it's not going to happen.
As well as, look, take their opinion with a grain of salt. They didn't do Rise of the Resistance.
Oh.
They just skipped it.
Doesn't count.
They did Smuggler's Run.
That's worse.
But their reasoning was that they couldn't get into the queue. It was really long and they didn't want to pay the money for it.
We've been talking about the Disneyland version, but that's still open. If you go to Disneyland today, you can ride it. I swear this ride never even goes down for refurbishment. I've never seen it closed in pretty much the entire time I've been there. But you can no longer ride it at Walt Disney World. And this is because in 1997, Disney tentatively released a statement that they were considering replacing Mr. Toad's Wild Ride with a Winnie the Pooh themed attraction at the Magic Kingdom. Only a day after the initial news broke, a Save the Toad webpage was set up. Fans concerned about the upcoming closure wanted to change Disney's mind, so distributed their own shirts, posters, and other materials to publicize the issue. Participants also regularly conducted peaceful Toad-ins at the Magic Kingdom, where they would come and just stand outside the ride with like shirts that say like "Don't demolish Toad Hall," and like give out pamphlets to people informing them what Disney was planning to do to Mr. Toad's Wild Ride.
And what does this sound like? What does this whole thing sound like? Sounds very similar to something opening up in a couple of weeks. A certain movement that failed, which historically as well failed, because at the end of the day, Disney, and this hurts me to say, but Disney doesn't care about passionate fans. Disney cares about what makes them money. They are a business. They are going to do what brings people through the gate. And if they know that they're losing money from a certain attraction or that it's gone on a little bit too long, then they're going to change it out for something that makes them money. It's not about making a statement or anything. It's just about money.
Yeah, especially with the merchandising of Winnie the Pooh alone. It didn't matter how many people protested. The merchandising opportunities of Winnie the Pooh plush toys was infinitely bigger than Mr. Toad plush toys, so the decision was already made.
It's a very good point about Mr. Toad at Disneyland, there is essentially no shop or anything attached to it. You can't get Mr. Toad merchandise anywhere. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. Whereas even Winnie the Pooh, which is halfway across the park in the middle of nowhere, still has massive exposure absolutely everywhere.
And interestingly, the only Mr. Toad merchandise item I've ever seen was part of the 50th collection at Walt Disney World, which was looking back on the past. So they would actually do these protests so often, even though they were, they were nice, they would just stand there, they weren't violent or anything. Disney would actually put plainclothes security guards all over, just like riding Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, like hanging outside Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, just to keep an eye on these people. That's the dream job. There's a picture of a plainclothes security guard that I saw, just like riding Mr. Toad. And that was his job, apparently. Make sure they weren't like messing around.
Because they all have the same look. They essentially just look like Disney World polo dads. You know exactly what I'm talking about if you've been to Walt Disney World. It's just, they should be grateful that they never got the hose on them. It's like, go away. Walt himself walks out. It's like, go away. Go away.
However, as we all know, this Save Toad Hall movement was unsuccessful, and the ride would officially close on September 7th, 1998, as part of their plans to family-friendlify the Magic Kingdom. That was a wordy thing. I don't know if it works, but they were removing things that they thought were too wacky or too crazy or too scary. They would, a few years later, get rid of like Snow White's Scary Adventure. And this makes sense, unless, of course, you just look 5 minutes walked around the corner where the extraterrestrial alien encounter opened 2 years earlier. So how they were friendly-ifying the Magic Kingdom when opening this at the same time, I don't know, but that was one of Disney's official stances as to why Mr. Toad closed.
Teenagers are still part of the family, Luke, and Breck Eisner thought that the Magic Kingdom was boring. So they needed something for Breck.
And whatever Breck Eisner wanted, he got, as we know with Splash Mountain. But that pretty much does it for Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. I would argue the wildest ride at Disneyland. Not the wildest ride in the wilderness, Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. The ride where you get drunk, drive around a city, and get sent to hell, only to be left there forever with no more churros or popcorn allowed for you.
I will say that this attraction is kind of a ticking time bomb. It's on the list of attractions that Disney probably wants to get rid of relatively soon. I've also heard rather controversially that the Tiki Room's also on that list.
Oh, there's a list. There's a whole list, and I've heard of like a number of attractions that are completely or partially on that list of clean it up or get rid of it. It's how we ended up with things like the Country Bear Jamboree upcoming redo, or the Jungle Cruise changes. There's a list a lot longer than you probably think, and I guarantee you Mr. Toad's somewhere on there.
Because part of that list is things like people may not see Tiki Room as something particularly offensive, but at the same time, Tiki in itself has an interesting heritage, and a lot of the people who did the voices in the Tiki Room say of, representing Mexican heritage or representing German people. They were just white dudes. Just white dudes doing voices.
Yeah, most of them would just, Walt knew from working at Disneyland or working in the studios and was like, hey, do the most cliche offensive version of this person's accent, why don't you?
And being the 1950s, they were like, yes, please. So I'm Dom.
And I'm Luke.
And we have successfully documented and discussed Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Good night.